So let me get started first with a huge thank you to Gary Gereffi. He is world renowned, and many of us know him just as Gary, husband of Pela. Gary is Emeritus Professor of Sociology and Director of the Global Value Chains Center at Duke University. He received his BA degree from the University of Notre Dame, and he got his PhD from Yale. He has published over a dozen books, numerous articles on globalization, industrial upgrading, and social economic development. And he's just pretty incredible. He gives talks all over the world, and that we're lucky enough to have him be here amongst us and be willing to spend the hour with us. Gary, thanks a million, and I am going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sue, and Penny and Pela, the organizers of this series. I've been privileged to participate in many of these Campus Club events as listener and sometimes as speaker, and I'm happy to kick off this new series that we're starting. So the topic I chose, COVID-19 is inescapable. It's all around us, and most of the things we associate with COVID-19 are negatives in terms of the school closings and all the social distancing and many other problems. But one area from my point of view has been a positive. Because of COVID-19 discussions, everybody is interested in supply chains. And supply chains is something that I have studied at Duke, especially this question of why are certain goods not produced in the United States? And why do US companies go to other parts of the world? And I've been asking that same question, I guess all the way back when I started to do my dissertation on the pharmaceutical industry in Mexico back in the 70s. And the question persists. We have plenty of international production by US companies. So what I wanted to do today is zero in on one area of shortages, because I think that's what's gotten a lot of attention with COVID-19. We've heard of shortages of personal protective equipment. By the way, I think somebody's mic is still open, so maybe everybody can mute themselves, as Sue said, so we don't hear the background. But we've heard a lot about shortages of face masks and gloves and hospital gowns and ventilators and paper towels, and of course, the ubiquitous toilet paper. And so the question is always, what causes these shortages of such essential items? So I want to focus in on medical supplies, and I'll talk primarily about face masks and a bit about ventilators. But I want us to really try to understand the kind of the why question, because there's a lot more nuances to the story about both why we have shortages and how we might deal with them than we might expect. So what I want to do in the presentation is I'm going to sort of frame this why question. I'll talk about international trade, which is one of the ways we typically get a lot of these products. We import them. I'll talk about China. China is a big part of any discussion of supply chains and US competitiveness. From the US point of view, I'm going to shift and look at two sides of the US response. One, what US private companies have been doing. Do we have shortages because of what we might call market failure among US firms? Or are the shortages more due to what we might call policy failure by US government? Those two sets of factors interconnect. And then I'll end with this question of where do we go after COVID-19? What are the options for more resilient supply chains? And this is a big topic, by the way, not just among public health people, but also among international business scholars. They're asking these supply chain questions. So if we think about the global pandemic associated with the coronavirus, it's really a twin crisis that we have. It's very obviously a global health crisis. This virus was first discovered in the late December 2019, but say publicly, January of 2020, it was announced to be located in Wuhan, China. And in a matter of about 3 months, it circled the world, hit virtually every region, every country. So by now we have an enormous set of global cases, over 40 million cases of COVID-19, 1.1 million deaths worldwide. So its health implications have been dramatic. It's been global and it's been fast, and therefore it's been very, very hard to adjust to. But simultaneously, it's a big economic crisis because as COVID-19 has affected all these different countries, initial response was to close down their economies in order to get people isolated from one another as a way to try to contain the virus. But these economy-wide shutdowns then gave rise to what we might call demand spikes. As the number of COVID-19 cases emerged in country after country, industries were shut down, people were going to hospitals because of these cases, and this produced this ongoing set of supply shortages. So in some ways, it's a natural problem. We have a health crisis. It's causing lots of cases. Industries are closed down. We have shortages of medical products. So the question is, what do we do about this? And how have different countries been handling it?
Got
So
it.
let's just look first at COVID itself.
Yeah, I can, I think.
Okay, I think we have a mic open. So this is a case, we've seen these maps, New York Times and many other places put these out. Unfortunately, the numbers keep going up. In the case of the United States, most recent figures from today, we've got over 8.2 million cases of COVID-19, over 220,000 deaths. So to put that in perspective, we've got about 4% of the world's population in the United States, but about 20% of the cases and about 20% of the deaths. So something is amiss for the United States, the richest country in the world, one of the most developed countries in the world, to also be the country that has experienced the worst outbreak of COVID-19. And we've had the toughest time getting it under control. And we know that the discussion about how and why this has taken place has been swirling around us for months. But if we look at this kind of current phase, one of the things we also notice is that we never really got the virus under control, but we've had now several peaks. There was a peak in April, and early on, people were claiming that April was going to be the worst period of COVID-19. And sure enough, April 10th, we had over 31,000 cases. It started to taper off a bit. And then again in July, we had another peak of 66,000 cases. And now here in October, we're seeing a third peak. So it looks like we have never really gotten this under control the way Europe seemed to after their first peak. But lo and behold, we're now hearing in the news the last week or two, cases are spiking again in Europe. Europe's total cases is now bigger than the US, India, and Brazil combined. So it's clearly not an easy virus to contain and control. So this ongoing health crisis is something that every country has been struggling with. Some countries have done a lot better than others, but we're certainly in a very bad situation with our three peaks and never having really got this under control. And now heading into a winter, people predict it's going to be even worse. So let me try to give you a supply chain story about the shortages that I mentioned for some of the medical supplies, in particular face masks and ventilators. And so the question I want to ask is a fairly simple one. Why is the world's richest country still struggling to meet domestic demand for essential items such as face masks that cost less than $1 a piece? I mean, it would seem that for an economy as advanced as ours, with the most advanced pharmaceutical industry and advanced electronics industries and digital economy, not to be able to supply basic items like face masks, gloves, and other medical supplies seems a real anomaly. So to address this, I want to do a kind of a longitudinal analysis at 3 points in time. First, I want us to get a sense of how these global value chains is another way to talk about global supply chains. It's these international production networks that help us understand how goods are produced in different parts of the world and traded and consumed in other parts of the world. So first, I want to get a sense of how the medical supply, say the face mask, value chains were organized before COVID-19, last couple of years. Second, what happened during the crisis? Why has this shortage been such a problem? And finally, what are we learning from this crisis? Where are we going to go after COVID-19 in terms of these products and these supply shortages? Are we learning anything that will create what are called more resilient supply chains? And to just give you a sense of the international business debate, one of the arguments is that these supply chains for products like face masks have become highly dependent on key countries around the world, like China and Asia. They've become rigid. And so this idea of resilient supply chains is sort of the opposite. How do we make supply chains be more responsive? So let me start with the trade story. So there's been an industry now of studies that have been talking about COVID-19 goods. So COVID-19 goods are all the kinds of products that are involved in treating patients and used to protect healthcare workers connected to COVID-19. So they include a lot of the products that are listed on this diagram: the face masks, bed sheets, surgical gloves, needles and catheters, tubes, etc. These kinds of devices are really in two categories. One, the things that we would call personal protective equipment are the low-tech goods. They're basically the face masks, the medical gloves, hospital gowns, fairly simple low-tech products. But then there's also higher tech products like these patient monitoring devices or the ventilators that help people breathe. And even beyond those, we've got the testing kits and we've got some of the pharmaceutical products. So there's a wide range of medical supplies. But what I want to call our attention to is each of these boxes is telling us who were the main suppliers worldwide in terms of global exports for each of these products in 2018. So 2018, clearly before the pandemic. And so for some of these products, China is a leading supplier for the textile face masks, for the bed sheets, for some of the non-woven protective garments. For other products, it's other Asian countries. For surgical gloves, for example, Malaysia and Thailand are both important because they're very important rubber producers. And the latex that they have is also turned into synthetic rubber. For other products, like some of the generic pharmaceuticals, India is a big producer. So on the one hand, Asia is a major source of supply for the fairly low-tech, low-cost goods. But for a lot of the other higher tech products like monitoring devices or ventilators, the key suppliers are advanced industrial countries: US, Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands, UK. So we have a mix, but I'm going to be focusing mainly on the face masks, which, as we're going to see, are Asia source. So if we take a look, and there's a particular emphasis on China in a lot of this discussion, because China is now the world's largest exporting country. So China passed both the US and Germany as the top exporting country in the world. China is the second largest economy in the world after the United States. And China is interesting and important because it doesn't just produce low-tech products like these face masks or toys or shoes or clothes, but China is also a very important producer and exporter of high-tech goods. It's the country that has the largest amount of high-speed rail. It's the leading electric car producer in the world. It's got biggest e-commerce platform in the world, et cetera. So China is a really full-fledged competitor, high tech, low tech. And as we know, under the Trump administration, US and China have been involved in this trade war. So China is a pretty important place. But if we look at this diagram, if we look at all personal protective equipment, those basic items that are used by healthcare workers and patients, 50% of world imports in the EU come from China. About 48% of US imports come from China. So we get about half of all of our personal protective equipment from China. But for other products, other countries are, China's much less important. And we can see that here on this graph, that a lot of these trade figures, we have to be very product specific. So for the protective garments, like the respirators or surgical masks, or for medical goggles, China produces exports more than the rest of the world combined. But for other things like shoe covers or hospital gloves, it could be Thailand or India for gloves, sorry, Thailand or Malaysia for gloves. Honduras is a big supplier of medical gowns. Mexico is a big producer of garments. So there's actually a lot of countries that supply these products that we've been importing. So the question that we need to understand from the trade side is, why has China and Asia dominated the exports of this personal protective equipment? As we saw in those earlier diagrams, China itself exports more of this PPE than the rest of the world combined. And I think we have to see that China has two big advantages. On the one hand, China's always been known because it has low cost, and that's partly because it has a very large workforce. And so China, beginning in the 2000s and 2010s, has become the #1 exporter worldwide of virtually all of the consumer goods we see on a Walmart shelf. 2/3 of them are probably coming from China. But China also has a second big advantage, which is scaling up of production. It's not just that their costs are low, but they're able to produce these goods at a volume that is able to supply the rest of the world. Some countries can have low costs, like Honduras, but their production capacity is relatively limited. So China's got these two advantages, and in particular, we're going to look later at this scale up of production. So if we look at these factors, part of what is going on here is there's very much a kind of blame China mentality, or China's the villain in a lot of these stories. Like, why are we so dependent on China for imports of these different products? But if we look at it from the point of view of US manufacturers and say US hospitals for medical supplies, the question really is, why are they buying from China? It's not like China is an aggressive exporter that's seeking out all these markets. China can only export those volumes if they have willing buyers on the other side. And I think what we often don't understand is that the US business model has changed dramatically between, let's say, from the turn of the 20th century to about the 1960s. The US became the biggest industrial country in the world because we had one big advantage: mass production. The Ford Motor Company, and then later lots of other US companies, introduced movable assembly lines. We were the top volume producer worldwide of lots of different products because we perfected this mass production process. And during World War II, that allowed us to scale up for military equipment. And so by the end of the 1960s, that helped account for a dominance in US production of manufactured goods. But in the 60s and 70s, that model changed to something else that's called just-in-time production, or lean production. And Fordism, mass production, big factories, giant assembly lines, were replaced by lean production, which is associated with Toyota and Japan. And the just-in-time production was not producing really large volumes out of giant factories, but organizing supply chains that had very low inventories, that had suppliers clustered around an end producer. So the just-in-time system was much more of a network model. And very importantly, it was based on low inventories. So if you're a just-in-time producer, you don't want to have these big inventories that the giant mass production factories needed. You want goods to be coming within 2 or 3 days of when you need them. Your suppliers have to be very flexible and located nearby. That also produces higher quality. It's not just manufacturers that think that way, but hospitals as well. The healthcare sector is got some of the highest, the most cost conscious companies. So hospitals also don't want big inventories. They want to buy as they need it. So part of this problem, why do we have shortages, is because we didn't have big inventories. And we didn't have big inventories because this new business model of just-in-time production that both US manufacturers and US hospitals prefer has led us to say we're much better off importing from countries like China and Mexico and other low-cost producers than making it ourselves. But importing as much as we did from Asia ran into a big problem with COVID, because by April, all the countries that had the virus hit them began to introduce export controls on essential personal protective equipment items. So the way we got these items in the past, import them, was blocked by March or April, and that threw the emphasis on domestic production. So then the question is, if we're going to need face masks, gloves, gowns, or ventilators, how fast can we ramp up domestic production? So I'm going to look at that first. We'll look at the face mask case in greatest detail, because that's the product that is in highest demand. You know, as we'll see, both healthcare workers, but also all of us as individuals, when we're walking around the streets, we're all told face masks is one of the greatest and simplest ways of protecting ourselves against COVID-19. Two basic types of face masks we've certainly seen them, but just to draw our attention, this one on the right, this blue one, is called a surgical mask. So the surgical mask has those ear straps, and it's a way of filtering, but basically surgical masks basically protect other people from us. The user, the surgical mask helps keep any kind of spray or virus from the user from spreading very easily. But these other masks here, these ones called N95, are have much greater filtering capacity, and those are the ones that are used by the healthcare workers themselves. So whereas this surgical mask is cheap and easy to buy, and everybody is encouraged to use this, the N95 mask is particularly important for healthcare workers. And this article, there's a lot of great articles in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and others about the mask story. So I'm going to focus a little bit on the difference between these masks, but I also want to stress what makes these masks effective, because we've all seen lots of great homemade face coverings, and Pela has done great ones of Duke, and other people have been doing lots of very creative masks. But the key is going to be the filter, and that's going to be an important item in understanding this shortage. So surgical mask, loose fitting, designed to trap sprays and droplets from coughing and sneezing, therefore particularly by the user. The N95, and they're called respirators, but fit more tightly and protect the user from 95% of smaller airborne particles. One big difference, surgical masks have ear straps, N95 respirators have head straps. And if you have an N95 respirator that doesn't have a head strap, it's a counterfeit. And lots of those have been coming in from other countries. Key thing with the mask is they've all got 3 layers, at least, of non-woven and textile fabrics. The inner layer closest to the mouth absorbs moisture. Then there's the filter layer. That's the critical element that screens out the bacteria. And then there's an outer layer for splashes. Key thing about these masks is that they're basically very cheap before the COVID crisis. The surgical mask box of 100 would cost US $4 retail. About 20 of the N95 masks cost about $17, or again, less than $1 a piece. And these are retail prices. And if you buy in bulk, the way hospitals do, of course, the prices would be even lower. But during the pandemic, when we had shortages, these surgical masks were selling for up to $20 each. And N95 masks, you couldn't find them. So this is the problem. The problem is items that were essential and cheap before the crisis became incredibly hard to find and expensive after the crisis. And I want to highlight a factor that I think we don't understand well enough, which is about the filters, why the shortages exist. And I think that we have a basic face mask bottleneck. The main input in both types of face masks is a non-woven polypropylene fabric. I'll call it PPP. Not just used in face masks, but they're widely used in baby diapers, feminine hygiene products, disposable wipes. Polypropylene is probably the most widely used petrochemical in the world because it can be used for so many different products. Now that means petrochemical, it comes from oil as its basic feedstock. But what's important about the filters used in face masks is that it's a non-woven fabric that is melt blown to obtain fibers of a smaller diameter in a random pattern that can trap small particles. And this specialty fabric, melt blown PPP, is made by only a limited number of countries worldwide, companies worldwide. N95 masks also are pretty complex products. Even though it looks pretty simple, that surgical mask and the N95, they've got over 65 parts with different kinds of protection. But what I want to show us, there's a great article that appeared in the Washington Post that had some nice diagrams of these filters, and especially this non-woven fabric, which I think is really interesting to see. So this is what the filter looks like from that non-woven polypropylene. Each fiber is about 1/50th the size of a human hair, blown together in a random web to create a kind of obstacle course for these different particles. Whereas woven fabrics have a very clear symmetrical pattern. And all the weavers that among us would understand the knit shirts and all of the sort of traditional textile industry, that was different types of weaving, but non-woven has become the biggest specialty item because its absorptive capacity is incredible. When you look at this under a microscope, you see that this is set up so the N95 fibers permit airflow around them. So that makes it easy for nurses or patients to breathe. And here we're talking about the more sophisticated masks. But the fibers in these filters have an electrostatic charge that attracts bigger molecules to stick to them. So it acts like a magnet to attract and trap large molecules. And the smaller particles, which are sometimes harder to trap, also get attracted by this kind of maze pattern and electrostatic setup. So the reason I showed these diagrams, and in that Washington Post article, they have a nice animation, is to show that that raw material, that non-woven fabric, that is the key ingredient in all the face masks. And that's the bottleneck. If we're saying, why don't we have more face masks produced in the US or in different countries of Europe? It's often because we don't have enough production of that key item. And here's where a country like China has really stepped up in a way that other countries haven't been able to match. So the Wuhan outbreak of coronavirus was first detected late December. In January, and February, Wuhan shut down, and all of China began to focus on producing more of this personal protective equipment to contain their outbreak. But these facts about China production are pretty incredible. Chinese surgical mask production increased 12-fold in 1 month. In February, it went from 10 million masks a day to 115 million masks a day. Not a 12% increase, it's a 1,200% increase. From March to May, China exported, after it was producing for its own domestic use, over 70 billion face masks, 3 months, which was more than triple total world production of 20 billion face masks in all of 2019. And China was responsible for half of that. And the number of Chinese companies registered to make and trade face masks, about 67,000. Now, I'm putting all of these facts because if you compare them with the US or any other country, China is orders of magnitude beyond where other countries are. If we say how many countries in the US make face masks, it might be 1,000. And big ones, maybe a couple hundred. So China's got this enormous capacity. And another bottleneck is actually the mask making machinery. All these companies in the US that were asked to make more face masks, as they started to scale up production, companies in California and elsewhere, they discovered that the mask making machinery also was in short supply. That was coming from places like Taiwan and China, and they had backlog orders. So, and finally, if we get to that non-woven fabric itself, China scaled up production used for face masks to 150 tons a day. That's 5 times what China was making before the pandemic. So in 3 months, they scaled up from 30 to 150. But it's also 15 times the total output of all US companies of this PPE non-woven fabric, even after US firms ramped up their production in spring. So I just wanted to show us that China's scale-up ability to go from already a pretty large production to 10, 15, 20 times more in a matter of months, no other country in the world comes close to that. The US in World War II was the only country that had that kind of performance in certain key industries. So that's part of China's advantage. And if we come back to it, you say, so can US companies make this non-woven fabric? Definitely they can. They make it for diapers. They make it for lots of other products. But American companies are reluctant to expand their capacity for this fabric the way Chinese companies did, because they believe US mass demand will be temporary, whereas China is supported by the government or forced by the government to do this kind of a ramp up. So we have a market-based economy that makes us much more cautious in terms of ramping up production compared to what China can do. So that's just the background on trade and China and where the competition comes from. Let's just look now at the US government response, and then we'll look at the private sector response. So there's been really detailed reporting on decision-making in the Trump administration. We're probably familiar with a lot of these items, but Trump first found out about COVID-19 in a briefing from Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar in mid-January. January 21st, first COVID-19 case detected in the US. So we're sort of starting from a timeline where January, we're already aware that COVID-19 could be a big problem. Peter Navarro, who we've probably seen on TV a lot, wrote a very detailed memo to Trump on January 29th, warning that this could have a massive loss of life. So we didn't see the first action from President Trump until January 30th, when he halted some flights from China. He keeps saying, I've stopped everybody coming in from China, but this did not include US citizens. So it didn't stop everybody, but it was something that nobody else was doing at the time. So he was out in front of trying to do some halting. And then we learned from Bob Woodward's book that in February, Trump really was aware of the seriousness of the COVID crisis, but he didn't want to tell the country about it. But another big problem we've been hearing a lot about why we don't have enough testing. Well, back in February 8th, CDC, which is under Health and Human Services, developed some rapid diagnostic tests for COVID-19, which looked like it was going to put us ahead of the curve, and they were found to be contaminated. It was a complete public relations disaster for the US and for CDC to have created these contaminated testing kits. So all testing stopped, and it was 2 months or so before we caught up. Later on, we learned that Trump canceled some meetings that were telling him more about this coronavirus because, again, he was getting negative news. And by the end of February, basically, Health and Human Services and CDC were removed as the head of the response. Then this White House coronavirus task force was created with Mike Pence at the head. The first mention that the rest of the country heard about coronavirus really came on March 16th when Trump issued the first social distancing advisories. Then he started to use the Defense Production Act to get companies like 3M, the largest producer of face masks, to increase its production. And by early April, 3M and Honeywell, other big US companies, said they were going to increase production, increase imports from China. FEMA started to introduce bigger contracts. So the US started to respond, but not until mid-March did we begin. So we were at least 2 months behind when we first knew about it. And an exponential curve like the coronavirus, that's a lifetime in terms of problems. So what are the takeaways on the policy side? I think for Trump, PPE was never a top priority. We know that that the administration and President Trump in particular has been in public denial about the seriousness of COVID-19, and we've been playing catch up. Social advisories came late. And as we've heard again and again, face masks, which were widely used in Asia, and that was the main reason why countries like Korea, Singapore, China, et cetera, were able to control the virus. Face masks in the US were not really emphasized from the government. At best, we had mixed messaging. The coronavirus task force was telling us, yes, the doctors like Dr. Fauci or Deborah Birx were saying face masks are important, but it really wasn't something that was used very much, that was promoted by the government. Defense Production Act, which forces companies to make goods, that was used by Trump for face masks and ventilators, but it was really a clumsy tool for the fast moving virus. When Trump tried to use the Defense Production Act in late March to get 3M to increase production, this prediction was that 2 weeks later was going to be a peak demand. And companies couldn't get those supply chains organized for at least 2 months. So this was another problem. I think the real focus for Trump from the beginning has been vaccines. I mean, if you can't control the virus using face masks, if you could come up with a vaccine, hopefully that would be a way to shortcut the process. But as we know, that's a really tricky set of issues, and it's a global race for R&D. But that's kind of where Trump's priority was. What about the private sector? Did US private companies do much better than the government in responding quickly? And I think private sector did ramp up production, but it was relatively late and somewhat cautious. So on the face mask side, the top US producers are 3M, which is based in Minnesota, and Honeywell. Trump invoked the Defense Production Act on April 2nd to require 3M to expand production of these masks and to import more from China. 3M said they would do it. There were back and forth about what about 3M's exports to other countries that were already in the pipeline. But in the end, 3M said they would do it. And in March, 3M was producing about 50 million masks a month, and Honeywell about 20 million. But as we're going to see here, the 50 million and 20 million that Honeywell and 3M were producing, and other US companies total were producing about 80 million N95 masks in March of 2020. But the demand estimated in the coronavirus was about 300 million. So we had this huge shortfall of nearly well over 200 million masks a month. That was this production gap that US companies had to try to make up. So that was the challenge. How do you decrease that gap? US government started to issue new contracts. Since the two biggest companies by themselves couldn't do it, we started to get in a lot of third-party suppliers, smaller companies, but they were charging prices many times higher. So it took us 2 or 3 months to ramp up production. But I think by midsummer, the private sector did a pretty good job. 3M doubled its output to about 1 billion masks in May, and it was going to double again to about 2 billion in 2020. So if we look at the private sector response, I'd say despite a late start, domestic producers of face masks like 3M and Honeywell increased production 4-fold to 8-fold from March to August. They were developing some partnerships with other companies. But the biggest thing from the industry point of view is they're just saying, look, we can produce the face masks, but it's not profitable for us to make this long term. And if we listen to people in the Trump administration, there's a big push. There's a kind of anti-globalization emphasis, which says we're depending too much on countries like China and Mexico for imports. We should bring more of that production back to the US. But when you talk to the companies themselves that are doing it under emergency conditions, they're saying, yes, we can produce now to these government contracts, but it doesn't make sense for an advanced economy like the US to be producing N95 face masks when we can buy them from China, Thailand, or India at 1/20th the price we could make them here. So the Trump administration response was denial of the problem at the beginning, slow decision making, no real planning. As we know, they threw out the Obama pandemic playbook early on, a lot of misinformation, no lead agency really controlling the process, and no distribution strategy to get protective equipment to states and hospitals. So in the end, I'd say, see, what's the biggest cause of the PPE shortages in the US? I think policy failures were even more important than market failures. Private sector was ramping up pretty well, but I think our policy response was too slow, too late, and with no real conviction that this was important. So let me just give a quick counter case of ventilators, which is a much more complicated product, whereas the face masks limited exposure to the virus for the entire population. Ventilators were critical to keep the sickest patients alive. And as we recall, early in the pandemic, in March and especially April and May, ventilator shortages at hospitals were widely being claimed as the cause of many, many potential deaths because of how many people were in intensive care units. In March, US officials panicked. We had about 10,000 ventilators in the national stockpile. New York State alone said that they needed 30,000 ventilators. So a big shortage of ventilators. And the response from the Trump administration and US companies was really pretty dramatic. It was like a wartime alliance of, we've got to produce ventilators. Trump turned to big auto companies like General Motors and Ford to partner with these medical ventilator makers to try to get ventilators out as quickly as possible. Again, he used the Defense Production Act to order GM and other companies to produce ventilators. So GM signed big contracts to make 30,000 ventilators. In April, their total goal was to build 200,000 ventilators. They partnered with a Seattle company called Ventec. Ford had its target of making 50,000 ventilators. They were partnering with another company that was Florida-based, also quite small. Question like, why did Trump turn to automakers? Because automakers are great, the best US companies at managing large, complex supply chains. A typical automobile maybe has 20,000 to 30,000 parts. The ventilators have 250 to 650 parts, but if any of those parts are missing from the supply chain, you can't build the product. So the key was, how can you create a supply chain that can handle all of this complexity in these parts and bring them together in order to make the final product? The unexpected story, though, in ventilators was that after this massive effort to increase production, and supply of ventilators in the US stockpile surged from 10,000 in April to over 95,000 by mid-August, the demand for ventilators plummeted. Of those 95,000 ventilators that are now in the US stockpile, only 1,000 were used to treat COVID-19 patients. We've got over 94,000 that are now stuck in surplus. Why the dramatic mismatch? And we've certainly heard this in the news. It's because treatment of COVID-19 patients evolved and the percent of hospital patients put on ventilators has fallen significantly. So this also just shows us the challenge of governments and private companies in responding to this kind of crisis. We know that everybody was calling for more ventilators. Private companies and government get together and try to supply them, but then conditions change and now we've got a big surplus. So this shows the dangers and the difficulties in coming up with effective responses minus a kind of planning blueprint. I'm going to conclude with just a couple final slides just about, what would we learn from this experience of shortages and ramp ups and gluts versus not enough production? What would these more resilient supply chains look like? I think the discussion right now, and this is very much on key to the presidential debates right now, because whoever the next administration is going to have to deal with this problem. There's several options to reduce this rigidity of supply chains or make them more resilient. One is that you can make them shorter, that instead of sourcing from Asia, we could be sourcing regionally from places like Mexico or Central America. That would bring products quicker to the US market. Big one, make them more domestic, reshore production rather than offshore it, or make these supply chains more diversified. Instead of relying on one or two key countries for these goods, we should be choosing 5 or 6 countries. So all of those are very sensible strategies to create greater resilience. Policymakers have tended to associate resilience with greater domestic production or shorter supply chains. Basically, bring these goods home. You heard it whenever you hear Peter Navarro talk, or Robert Lighthizer, the main trade advisor for the US. The problem, though, as we saw in earlier slides, is reshoring personal productive equipment that is not profitable, like face masks, or that are no longer scarce, like ventilators, is economically inefficient. Companies will not do this. The only way they're going to bring production back, the big companies, is if they have government guarantees. And the government doesn't want to give long-term guarantees. So back to a market economy. Our market economies have strengths in terms of supply and demand sort of flexibility, but it's a problem when you're trying to guarantee this sort of production. So if we're sort of looking forward, and this is my last slide, when we have a pandemic like COVID-19, no country could be expected to produce all of the goods that were needed for these COVID-19 products. For face mask alone, global demand was going to be 10 times higher than world capacity just because of the surge of cases. So in some ways, this is a challenge that has no solution ex ante. I think the things that we will be talking about looking forward, the strategic options after the pandemic, one is definitely bolstering capacity at home. So that includes both reshoring and strategic stockpiles. For example, that strategic stockpile of N95 masks, we had a pretty big one of 40,000 back in 2008, 2009. Then the S1N1 swine flu virus came. We used a lot of the face masks and we didn't replenish them. So when you have stockpiles, you have to manage them effectively. And that's always a problem. My guess is that the things we're going to be producing more at home aren't going to be face masks, but it might be those key active ingredients like the non-woven fabric, maybe active ingredients for pharmaceuticals, and certainly vaccines. So we'd have to be smart in terms of what we try to produce at home. Certainly we can diversify international sourcing, not rely so much on China or just a couple of suppliers. Regional sourcing using Mexico, Canada, Central America much more effectively is, I think, a very, very obvious and reasonable option for the US. Final two, I think, recommendations: strategic partnerships across industries are important. What the automakers did with the medical device manufacturers was something that often happened in wartime production. You'd get companies that had related technologies that could produce what's needed in a crisis. So I think if we can identify those early on, they're going to be more effective than identify them at the last minute. And finally, I think where there's going to be greatest interest is government support for innovation, especially around vaccines. But the real concern with vaccines is what some people are calling vaccine nationalism, that every country is going to want to try to be the one that's going to come up with a vaccine. But in the end, that's going to have to be distributed to everybody around the world. So we're going to need billions and billions of doses of vaccines made and distributed. And I think that's going to be a role where the US could be a leader, but we're going to have much better planning and forward thinking than we did for these personal protective equipment and ventilator devices that I was just discussing.